But Jay, what do you got first?
So we kind of spoke about this a little bit. We'll dive into it a little bit deeper. And my deep dive is, why do offensive-minded head coaches get a bigger leash than defensive head coaches? And why does the goalpost get moved for those defensive head coaches? Perfect example. We were talking about Antonio Pierce earlier, another coach that got fired earlier this week and actually got fired like right after the game, Mayo. And then you go to guys like Robert Saleh as well. And I'll tell you why I brought him up. Let me first talk about Antonio Pierce and Mayo. We kind of went into deep detail about how Antonio Pierce literally came into the season hamstring struck, one arm tied behind his back, because if you don't have the quarterback in this league, it's hard to win games. Mm-hmm. And you saw what he did as an interim head coach, right? That team could have definitely went left. Everybody rallied around him. I mean, they're smoking cigars in the locker room after wins.
Inhaling them.
Exactly. He's so stupid, bro.
Not just buffing that thing.
Inhaling a cigar is diabolical. But again, this was a team that was talent deficient, but yet he was getting the most out of them. And he essentially almost led them to the playoffs. Like, I think they were one or two games back from getting into the playoffs. So he ends up getting the job. But yet not much changes in regards to, what they did to try to change the team. And we were talking about this earlier, while Rand Carthen got fired, but Callahan keeps his job. But Antonio Pierce got fired, but Tom Telesco keeps his job, which is baffling.
Mismatch.
But baffling, because now you're going to be in a scenario again where you got a new head coach, right? Is he going to mesh with the new GM? And that relationship, is it going to be rocky or not? But getting back to Antonio Pierce, you can't win when inept quarterback play. We saw that this team never quit, even though they were talent deficient. Brock Bowers will probably be an all-pro, and he deserves to be. But for him to do that with the quarterback play he had kind of speaks to how special he actually really is, right? Me and Mike already talked about it. We saw the offensive line actually take a step, because they struggled last year, and they actually played really well at times this year. So you can kind of hang your head on that. And we always talk about this, Kyle. When you want to build a team, you want to build it from the inside out, right? So Antonio Pierce kind of started doing that. I think one of the biggest things, people talk about their defense took a step back. People forget Christian Wilkins got hurt early in the season. Bro, he was their big free agent acquisition. It was supposed to be him and Max Crosby, and Max Crosby got hurt too. Like, those were supposed to be the dudes that were supposed to take over up front. And you miss your two best defensive linemen, but yet the other guys actually stepped up and still played hard. Now, again, it wasn't as dominant as it was last year, but when you're missing probably one of the top 2 or 3 defensive ends in the league. Yep. Christian Wilkins is a top 10 defensive tackle in the league. Yep. Like, you're going to struggle on defense. So it's just like, how do you expect him to have success when your 2 top guys go down, you don't have a good quarterback, right? And then you had to fire your offensive coordinator midway through the season because you weren't getting good play on the offensive side. Let's go to Mayo. Everybody and their mother, even if you just watch a hair bit of football, knew that was the least talented team in the league. The least talented team in the league, right? Now, Drake May, and that's why a lot of people thought Drake May would take a year out, because people felt like you can't put him in front of that O-line because he's going to get dismantled if you put him in front of that O-line. But we learned something from Drake May. He's a competitor. He's a guy that's not going to make excuses. He's going to keep swinging, right? Big-time arm. We saw that at North Carolina. Worked on some of his footwork, because that was my biggest thing for him at North Carolina. Matching that bottom half with his top half. It was all over the place in North Carolina. He worked on those things throughout training camp and throughout the season. And you saw him with receivers that would be most likely 3, 4s, or 5s on other teams make plays. I mean, Keyshawn Bootsy, a lot of people thought this dude was about to be out the league, and he became a real deep threat for them this year. So you saw what he did with not having much talent. But if you're Gerard Mayo, like, yes, he made some faux pas, but that happens when you're a rookie head coach. Yep. My thing is, if you're going to give me a real opportunity, give me a real opportunity to learn from some of my mistakes. Everybody kind of knew this was going to be a down year for the Patriots, right? So how do you fire a guy after you give them the opportunity, knowing that he's got the least talented roster in all of football? And yes, he made some mistakes. You can't publicly call your players soft.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll be devil's advocate here.
Yeah, no, you can't call your – I'm here, I got you.
Because I would hold a grudge.
Yeah, you can't call your players soft publicly, right? You got to think, once you're a head coach, you're no longer part of the locker room. You're no longer a player. Like, things that you might have been able to say in the locker room as a player, you can't say that as a head coach, right? But that's the growing, you know what I'm saying? That's the growing pains of being a first-time head coach. And my thing is, if you're going to give him a real chance, give him a real chance, because you didn't really add any talent to the roster this offseason. You re-signed a lot of guys on the team, from a team that wasn't good the year before, right? And then you actually lost a few pieces. When you talk about Matt Judon, which, again, he didn't play that well in Atlanta, but this was a guy that constantly was getting double-digit sacks for you. So it just wasn't the same. And you knew going into this year, you're going to have draft capital, you're going to have a boatload of free agency money to spend. And yet, why not give him an opportunity to fill out the roster and see what he can do and see if he can grow as a head coach? And then we go to the offensive side. We were talking about guys like Brian Callahan. You did spend a boatload of money in the offseason, and you end up getting the number 1 pick in the draft. But the GM get fired, and you didn't. Let's go to Brian Daboll, which I love. I think he's a really good coach, and I think he maximized, and to his detriment, maximized what he did with Daniel Jones that first year and got them into the playoffs, right? And I essentially hurt them because after that, they weren't in prime position to take a quarterback of the future because they were having success, right?
We got our guy.
And they paid Daniel Jones. They didn't pay Saquon Barkley. They didn't pay Xavier McKinney.
Jeez.
And also, I think Brian Daboll was hamstrung by what the GM did and some of the decisions he made. But yet, he kept his job for another year. And this is why I brought Robert Saleh, because people were telling me ad nauseum, as a head coach, it's your job to control the entire team. You're not just a defensive-minded coach. You're not just an offensive-minded coach. Okay, I get that. But let's not forget the Jets were like a bottom 3 defense in the league when he got there. He made them in a consistent top 5 defense year in and year out. But the same thing happened to Gerard, or not to Gerard Mayo, but Antonio Pierce. If you do not have the right signal caller, you have no chance to win in this league. And I thought it was premature, and I love Woody Johnson. Everybody knows that. I thought it was premature to fire him because the risk reward during that point of the season, they were fighting for first place in the AFC East, the risk outweighed the reward to firing him right there. Because now you move Jeff Albrecht, who was the best coach on your staff.
Everything falls apart.
To head coach, which means he can't focus on what he needs to do on the defensive side because he has so much on his plate. And now the defense isn't playing well. So it's just like, it's crazy to me that offensive coaches continue to, get extra opportunities. They get a longer leash than defensive coaches. And I say this because Zach Taylor's a perfect example. The last 2 years, that Bengals defense has been awful. Now, Lou Anarumo, 3 years ago, was considered maybe a hot head coach candidate for what he did and that defense did. Because people forget, during that playoff run, when they made it to the Super Bowl, the offense wasn't lights out for the Bengals. It was the defense that was keeping them in games, right? But me and Mike talked about this ad nauseum. When you have guys that go in the first round and don't develop like Myles Murphy, when your defensive tackles get hurt, when you allow guys like Jesse Bates to leave, and you're not extending guys like Trey Hendrickson, that shows a bad culture, not only from the team, but ownership as well. When you're not paying your foundational pieces,
culture.
Yeah, when you're not paying your foundational pieces, what makes you think other guys want to come and be a part of that? Because I see how you're doing Jamar Chase. I see how you're doing T. Higgins.
And how could you do him like that? And
now it's going to cost you more. Now it's going to cost you even more.
Yeah.
Trey Hendrickson led the league in sacks. So, but yet Zach Taylor got to keep his job because his offense was putting up historical numbers. Yeah. But yet they didn't make the playoffs.
Maybe it's just because they have Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins, and you should just pay those guys.
And last year they went 9-8 without Joe Burrow. So if we're being 100% honest.
Yeah.
So why does the goalpost get moved for defensive coaches and not offensive coaches?
I think there's two big things. One is just that in recent memory, it's been all offensive coaches. Last 5 Super Bowls, all offensive coaches on the winning end, losing end. So owners see that. Owners see, how do I get to the Super Bowl? They're looking at that. What do I want? It's been all offensive coaches of late. Now, some of that's because it's been all offensive coaches getting new jobs, but that's also like they see who's winning. Trending. That's that. And 2, defense, more so than offense, if I just had to peg it, is far more talent-based. You just have to have the horses. No DC can make magic with a shitty talent on a roster.
Chargers
Whereas
did this
offensively, who did?
The Chargers did this year.
Yeah, they still had Khalil Mack.
Is he not, dude? Did you not hear Justin Herbert talking yesterday about he knew that Coach Harbaugh was different when he found out?
He said he
remembers the day he was born. Old son, there's something there. It ain't right, but man, he can coach some football.
But even Harbaugh was an offensive coach to start. So but that's, I think the difference is that people see bad results on the defensive side of the ball and they think it's the coach doing so when they can't objectively evaluate the roster and say, we don't actually have the talent walking through that door to do it. Whereas offensive, like a very good offensive coordinator, say a Kyle Shanahan, a Sean McVay, they will still give you run of the mill to above average offenses just because they're that far ahead of everyone else. And so that's what everyone's searching for. And I think that's the biggest thing. Now, I think Robert Saleh is a different animal. I still maintain that he was fired for different reasons altogether other than performance on the football field.
I remember that conspiracy theory.
I still do. I mean, because of
it could be true.
Because it was week 4.
Yeah,
in a make or break season, they had to know that you fire your head coach, it's just things don't turn around. They had to know.
The history showed that.
So that, to me, I still maintain was not performance related. There's something going on behind the scenes, or not behind the scenes, maybe in your face, that everyone saw that Woody Johnson didn't like. But I think the other guys, it's more a factor of they expect a DC to immediately have a DC head coaching hire to immediately have a great defense, and that's just not the way of the world in the NFL. All right.
That is, makes me look inward as an offensive guy, because I know if I were to coach, I'd be on an offensive staff, and now I feel bad for the defensive guys.
Oh, it's tough.
Get let go.
But I actually was just breaking this down.
When
you look at like the landscape of the playoffs right now, I believe there's, if I'm not mistaken, 4, maybe 5 offensive-minded coaches that actually call the plays, right? And then when you look at the opposite way, I think there's 7 or 8 guys that are either defensive coaches or offensive guys. There's one special teams, John Harbaugh, obviously, or offensive guys, but they don't call the plays. Like, so Sirianni, Campbell don't call the plays. Harbaugh doesn't call the plays, right? John Harbaugh is special teams. And I think there's 3 or 4 defensive guys. I think Sean McDermott, who did call plays but isn't now, Todd Bowles, who calls the plays, D'Amico, who calls the plays. So I'm like, when you look at the landscape, I'm like, I get everybody wants the next offensive guru, but that's not necessarily how you win in this league. And the playoffs are indicative of that this year.
Yeah.